Jensen, Jacobus.
To the agendas. And we'll do roll call for the UIB.
Go ahead.
We'll open the meeting. Roll call, please, Brian.
Bolton. Yes. Varing. Weesey. Shelso. Here. Sawtell.
Yes.
3 present.
With that, we'll move down to item number 3, discuss capital improvement plan. Jody, do you want to lead that discussion?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council members and Utility and Infrastructure Board members. Am I not talking into it
There you
directly?
are.
There you go. So I thought I'd go through the capital improvement plan only to the extent that information that you need to make your decisions is not on the report itself, so that as you're making decisions and deciding what the capital plans will be in the future, you have all the information that you need. So starting on the first page, if we look at the sanitation, it's really small on there, but you all have it on your screens, I'm hoping. Okay. So on sanitation, there's an amount of $25,000 in the 2020 budget that is for a construction trailer. The shed that was out there was damaged by the floodwaters, and as a temporary fix, we brought in a construction trailer and then realized that if we were to purchase a construction trailer, we would allow for an indoor facility for a restroom out there for the folks that have to man that hut. And the sanitation is the waste transfer station. And that ends up providing some additional revenues to the general fund each year. And so we've been taking between $25,000 and $50,000 a year and setting it aside for future improvements, possibly.
Like this.
Exactly, like this. So you'll see, that's why it says reserves, because we actually have about $500,000 in reserves set aside for the waste transfer. Some of that is to make sure that we would also be able to contribute to any kind of commitment that we might have for the closure and post-closure at the coalition site. Sure.
Quick question, you were talking about the waste transfer station and then the damaged shack versus, and I'd been out there and I thought that was kind of odd. That shack was in play, the original shack was in play for a fair amount of time after the floods, was it not? I mean, that
Correct.
remained out there and people worked in there.
We had it, is my understanding, unless, Brian, would you rather talk about it?
No, we used it for a while until we had a report of mold, and so that's when we had to close it.
But it was cleaned out right after the flood.
It was cleaned after the flood, yes, but apparently they didn't do a thorough job.
So there was mold found in it, but we had employees that had been in there in that time frame that's rather confined?
It was,
Okay.
unfortunately.
My other question, well, my actual question, roundabout way like usual. With that, is that something that we could remit to FEMA for any kind of reimbursement? Because I know that's a cost, but at some point.
Yep, we will put it on the FEMA
Right.
schedule.
Have we done it yet, or is that something that we still have time to do?
It's included in our report of damages.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
The other piece of that is with going to a trailer instead of just repairing the facility as it is,
We won't.
where the attendant has to use a porta potty out on the site, they would be able to use an indoor bathroom, which would be very nice for those folks. But also in the event that we get another 100-year flood or 500-year flood, it would be still mobile. We could pull it out before the flood waters damaged it.
But
So,
we'll get the non-betterment cost of whatever that shack was worth, so.
yes, yes. Mhm.
We won't get the 25,000.
Right. And then, also on this page, under fire, you'll see the 800 megahertz portable radios. Oh, excuse me, it's up higher, it's the very first item on the fire. The 800 megahertz radio system. And it says cost share with police, and you'll notice that that's 0. We'll be honest, this is an accounting thing. It's, and we've gone back and forth, and so the fire chief and the police chief have been trying to keep track of this and making sure that we have it in the budget, and we do. But it's not really capital anymore because the system is in place. We're paying a capital lease for that purpose, and so we're showing that as principal and interest payments, not as a capital payment. So it's not that that went away, it's simply we're changing how we're approaching, how we're showing that on our reports. And there's 4 years remaining in the contract, and police and fire together pay $250,000 a year on that lease. Switching over to page 2. Under the grade area, the police chief had some items that, in lieu of a new building, these were things that needed to be done. And right underneath that, you'll see the Joint Law Enforcement Center. And you'll see that in the 2020 budget, it says PST, which would be Public Safety Allocation, Anticipation Notes, sorry. Anticipation notes. We would likely not be able to issue those until unless the only way we'd be able to issue those, let me say it this way, the only way we could issue those anticipation notes is if we had already taken it to a vote, which would be the May primary election in 2020, would be the only way we could issue those bonds. So that might be a sticking point in the timing of that particular project. So I wanted to call your attention to that.
But we could take it to a vote in November.
This November?
No, in November, which would be the general election.
Right, but that, the November 2020 actually is in our fiscal year 2021.
Okay.
So
gotcha.
it would push the, and
So
I believe the
to
one,
make it go into this budget, we'd have to do it in May.
yes.
You'd have to get pretty quick.
Right, right. And the 1.2, my understanding was that the 1.2 was for engineering costs, not actual
Yeah.
construction yet.
Which is why it's split between the 2 years.
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobus, you had a question.
Yeah, my question is there any hiccup with trying to get this onto the primary? Because I think it would be beneficial to get it done sooner than later, especially considering some of the conditions of the existing police station. Is there any issue
I
with
think,
this?
we accept the budget, and if we plan to move forward, then we get moving. Then it can happen. You know, we still have, there is time between now, I mean, as long as it's in probably by January, our intent by then, there's probably time, so.
Then moving on to the auditorium, which I believe is on,
It's under parks and facilities.
actually on the same page, right? It's on the same page that we were on, under facilities. Oh, I must have a page turned. I think it's page 3.
Top page 3.
Okay, I wanted to call your attention to a couple of things related to this. If you'd look in the column for 2020, you'll find that we have the general obligation bonds of $2 million that would be issued midsummer, early summer next year. Then we show grant money coming in of $562,500, and then a committed amount of $562,500. The total of those is the $1,125,000 grant that was awarded. And the agency has already sent us the first half, with the second half coming when the project is completed. So the first half of those revenues are sitting in our general fund now. So when we do our request for commitment of funds at the end of the fiscal year in September, we're going to include this 562 for that purpose. So that's why it shows as committed funds, but that's not priorly committed funds. These are funds that we're going to ask you to commit. And then on that page, you'll notice that you'll start seeing some Ks on this page. This is these are the projects that we've assigned that would be using Keno funds. That Keno property tax relief, it's $700,000 each year as it stands in the budget right now. These are the items that we would likely have to forego, at least part of them, if we didn't have that property tax relief coming in. So you'll see those show up because predominantly it's in the parks and the other recreation activities, and then also the library. And what we tried to do is assign those things that would be for the benefit of the community, not necessarily for the benefit of staff. So things like equipment or renovating offices or whatever it is in those areas, those would continue to be borne by general fund revenues, but the Keno funds, trying to think of things that would be outward looking and for the public use. That's why some of these in the park and rec departments are Keno, some are not. And so also, let's see, we're getting to the, that was all I wanted to cover on the general fund. You can see at the bottom of page 4, the kind of the sources of what dollars we're anticipating spending in each of those buckets. And we really aren't spending very much in terms of the general fund revenues themselves, less than $500,000 each year. So the funding sources are from research for capital, or from reserves, or from sales tax 55, which is the public safety portion.
So in there's like sales tax 56, sales tax 59, as we go through. Are those, is there a special designation for sales tax 56?
Those would be infrastructure dollars. And I don't believe there are any in the general fund for that.
I got it. I would just, as we went through, they were actually there. I mean, they were listed as, actually at the very bottom, it's sales tax 56, 404, 377. And up above, it doesn't show up, so that's why I asked the question.
You need a ruler across there, because that's
So
actually
it's
55.
sales tax 55, but
Yes.
okay.
Yeah,
But,
it's all
Yep,
55.
that 56 line is there, but it's blank.
okay. But it's infrastructure. I mean, that's where the real question was, the designation of 56
Is infrastructure.
is infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Public safety is to the 55. So before we turn to, on the capital plan, before we turn over to the street fund, I did want to mention something that, this is a little bit like the public's, the 800 megahertz radio system for the capital lease. When the street department, parks department, and the utilities warehouse will co-locate, in the anticipation is that building would be built in 2020. Rather than have each one of them own part of that building, we're having that building owned by the street department, but the other funds will contribute. And right now, based on the price of the building and then, or the estimated cost of the building, and then dividing it in half so that half of the cost would be borne by the street department because it would be their garage area, but then also a lot of storage and office buildings. Then the other half would be split 1/3, 2/3, with 2/3 going to the Parks Department. So this budget would include a $2,333,334 transfer from general fund reserves, and you don't have that previously committed, but that's what we would need to do to put that into the street fund toward that building. And the utility warehouse would be contributing $1,666,666 as well. And that's, we've split that out across the 4 funds. So that's not something that you'll see the street department building on the capital improvement plan as if they're building it all by themselves, but the funding, there's an OF that says other funds, that $4 million is coming from parks and coming from the utility warehouse. Because the warehouse itself is not all moving over there, only the mechanics shop is anticipated moving over there.
Jody,
Sorry.
you've got a $30 million highway allocation bond. Is that, we just did an allocation bond, is that right? 8 million?
We haven't done it yet.
But we voted on it?
On the 8 million, we actually, you actually haven't, you've stated an intent,
Okay.
but we have not had you vote on that yet. We would anticipate issuing that bond probably May or June of next year in anticipation of that final payment to the state.
And then this 30 million? Is,
Okay, so that's, you're stealing my thunder. I haven't got to the street fund yet.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, but, so I'm getting there. That's one of the things on my list, that big question mark. Exactly. Okay, so, did anybody have any other questions on the general fund capital?
I did.
Linda?
Yeah, I just wanted a quick comment on the, this was under the city auditorium remodel construction project. Down a few lines from that, there was 2 projects about $565,000 and then $324,000 that were from reserve.
Yes, thank you, Linda. That was one of the things that I missed on my list. Those are not previously committed reserves, for starters. The total of the 2 projects would be $889,000. And what those are energy projects. If you recall, the gentleman came through and did a
Energy audit.
building assessment. And if we chose to go forward with that project, my suggestion would be it's designed to give a payback over a certain period of years. I guess I don't know for sure. I've not talked to the gentleman or anything, but there is a payback on those energy efficiencies. It would make sense that it would come from reserves if it's not council's desire to make that investment, because there aren't funds available otherwise in the general operations of the city budget. So thank you for pointing those out, because I did want to talk about those.
So do we know what we're doing with each number? what we're doing with the 565, what you're doing with the 324. I mean, if,
Sure, I would defer to Kim if she
'Kay.
would want to come talk about
thank you.
that.
Kim Koski, Director of Parks and Recreation. I actually have the detailed information that I got from Nick Roseberry with Navitas. If we could enter that into the record, it gives a great explanation of each project and what it all entails, so I do have copies for everybody for that. There's more than enough.
Are we on, or I take a motion to receive?
Make a motion, we receive.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
You gonna do a roll call vote?
McLean? Ellis? Coons? Yerger?
Yes.
Jensen? Jacobus? Legvan? Motion carries 7-0, Mayor.
Okay, go ahead, Kim.
As I stated, these are slides from the actual presentation that Nick gave you previously during a city council meeting with the overall project. And it just kind of highlights the two buildings that I would be responsible for with Christensen Field Main Arena as well as the senior center. We're finding we're having issues out there with the HVAC, and just everything is basically original, and sometimes we can't find parts for it, we can't find the replacements. And we came up with this project as far as what we could do to improve those things out at the senior center and at the main arena. And I think the last two pages, the first few are all the graphs and bar graphs and pieces of the pie and pictures of what we have existing. And then the last 2 pages, it talks about the different summaries of each building. So the second to the last page is the project summary for the main arena. And as you can see, it lists what, on the barcode there, or the bar graph, what we would be replacing, and then the costs are broken down, and as well as the incentive, or the cost savings that we would have over the extension of it, so. And part of this would go with, I believe Troy Shaben has in his section that it would do with this building as well. So if you have any specific questions, I'll try to answer them, and if not, I can refer to Nick. He offered to come tonight, but I thought his handouts were pretty self-explanatory, and if you want to read them over and then have any questions, we'd be sure to happy to answer those for you.
Any questions for Kim? Thank you.
You bet.
And Linda, you still had questions, so, or I don't know if you still had questions or your questions were answered, or,
I was just trying to figure out the payback on that, so how much the investment was.
it looks like they're using a 15-year total finance cost. So it looks like they're, I mean, if we financed it, they were using 15 years at 3.5%. So I would say they're hoping savings over 15 years. Any other questions on the general fund? Okay.
Okay, looking at the street fund, which I believe starts on page 5. Some items to note. The first section there, you'll find the street maintenance department, their use of equipment. Mark's done a great job of laying it out in a nice pattern so that you can kind of see it's a replacement cycle kind of thing. When we visited with him, things like the street sweeper are just, it's due for a new one kind of thing. So typically, he keeps that within the amount that we get in the gas tax allocation between that and his operating budget. You'll notice that there's a multi-use building on that list, and that's where the $4 million in reserves comes from. Those were street fund reserves that have already been designated for that project, and then the $4 million in other funds that I previously described for you. Toward the bottom, you will see Johnson Road, Morningside to Fremont Drive construction. I wanted to call your attention to that. That was when Morningside Business Park was developed, the city of Fremont was considered the developer. And prior councils, I believe it was in 2012, allocated $444,000 for the paving of the street, stormwater, or excuse me, it did not include stormwater, and then water and sewer into that facility. Clearly, $444,000 is not the cost of the project anymore. And so in order to fund this project, we're anticipating going through a process where we would ask council to consider allocating an additional $750,000 of LB 840 funds for that project. Initially, when the contract was awarded, Dave said that the funds would come out of the street fund, and he's 100% right. But when we try and fund all of these projects, that's where trying to use the most restrictive funds first, that would be something that appears to be eligible for LB 840 dollars, and that we would want to increase that ask.
When we developed Morningside, Daryl at the time was interim city administrator, and at the time we were in the process of developing that. We put together all of the estimated costs, not only the street, but we put together all the costs, which included storm sewer, included water, gas, sewer, and all of that was put in there. And to develop it, the cost to be used was going to be the LB 840 infrastructure funds were going to be used for the entire project. So, prior council has approved use of that fund for this completion of this project.
Typically, when we spend LB 840 dollars, we look to a council resolution, and the resolution in the past was only for the $444,000. So
Right.
I would anticipate that we would bring forward a resolution in the very near future that would ask for that additional
The
piece. But
balance.
that's if the notion is that that's not what council wishes to do, then the question becomes, what project then will we not do next year? Because we'll need to fund this one. So bear that in mind as we're going through that. If council doesn't have the appetite to allocate those funds, those funds have to come from somewhere. And I was able to get in the street fund with the use of sales tax dollars and whatnot. In the 2020 budget, I was able to get all of those projects to fit using street fund revenues, sales tax, and then the highway allocation pledge bonds for the final payment for the bypass.
So the difference would be 310,000 if you've got 440 set aside or not.
No.
Additional.
No, we already had, we've spent some on against that 440. I
Okay.
think there's 395 left. We needed, and if memory serves, I was thinking that we needed an additional 750. But we'll go back through and double check those numbers before we ask, of course. Okay, something as big as the viaduct, you'd think I'd be able to see it right off the bat. But the question was asked earlier about the 30 million,
It's actually on page 7, I believe. Right-hand side,
thank you.
in the year 2020, 2021.
Yeah.
27,003, or 27 million and 3 million.
Right. So that was the one project that I was not able to cash flow, or rather cover with sales tax and the use of fund balance and reserves. So in order to move that forward, and we wouldn't use highway allocation pledge bonds. Those don't require a vote of the people. And we had the $3 million that had been previously, or excuse me, $2.9 million that had been previously approved in 2006. That would have been used using sales tax dollars to pay those back. And we could still issue that 2.9, but there's obviously a large deficit there. So the question becomes, where are we at on that project? What's reasonable, what's feasible? Given the Southeast Beltway is already on the, we only have one more payment left on that. But in doing so, we have to start paying back those
Bonds.
pledge bonds. And just a very, very rough estimate has us paying back principal in 2021 of another $500,000 out of the street fund. So I guess I would call your attention specifically to the viaduct and what our plans will be for that.
Which Dave talked about that at a couple
Last
council meetings ago. I think Dave talked about the schedule on that project, so.
Councilman Legman.
To me, it isn't feasible anymore. When the people voted for it in 2003, I think you said,
6.
It was
Six.
six. Mhm.
that was 2.9 million, and now it's 27 million. That would bankrupt us to try and feasibly do that. Bring it back to the vote of the people, fine, but to me, it's just not feasible anymore.
Councilmember Jacobus.
We had that discussion on finishing the environmental impact study. Has that been received and completed? And how much longer do we have to wait for that?
It's in the air. We're at
It's
their
in the air.
mercy.
Is it something that we need to do, or is that something totally out of our hands? So this is something feasibly, putting it to the vote of the people will likely have to fall into the November in order to put it in front of them. Is that correct?
Well, let's hope.
The timeframe, I'm hopeful
Yeah.
that that's, because if the voters voted it in, it'd be great to have that on that November.
Because my understanding, we'll get it back, then the state has to hold public meetings, then they have to wrap up the comments, and then they'll get it back to us again, and then it will be in our court, which will probably be next spring.
I think November would be very optimistic. I just don't
November
think that can happen
2020 would be optimistic,
No,
wow.
no, November of this year.
this
Oh,
year.
Yeah, we're not going to be doing that this year.
We're talking
and
the general election of 2020.
Yes.
that's-
Could be doable, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And at that point, obviously, we wouldn't be spending all $27 million in 1 year anyway. So we would have time. I guess that's one of the things that we could look at is how much we would reasonably expect with an election as late as November of 2020. How much would we anticipate even spending in that 21 year? Ideally, we'd probably move some of those dollars into the succeeding year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in all reality, you could probably move it all. You know, maybe leave 3,000 to 5,000 out, but I think you could. They probably won't take, if it goes through a bond issue, then you actually would go out for bid. And you still may have final engineering to do. That could put you into the spring of 21. Going out for bid in the summer of 21. At the end of the day, if you started construction, us needing money would be in that fiscal budget year of 21, 22, I think. But, I mean, that's, and, you know, it's gotta get approved. I mean, the people gotta want it, and initially, Mark, the initial project was 13.5 million. And we approved and our portion was gonna be 2.7 to 2.9. That's what we approved. Mike?
I guess I was kind of looking down a little further. I guess I'm kind of in agreement with Mark. You know, I think we've kind of outgrown this because the price has increased. But my question, I guess, would be these funds, if we allocated them towards the viaduct, would that be in competition with the levee repairs? Would that, I mean, is it going to compete for that?
Eventually, yes. It may not be a direct competition, you know, dollar for dollar, but as we go through, as I mentioned, trying to use the most restrictive first. If you use levy dollars here, then they're not available to use for the viaduct there.
Yeah, so we've already seen a significant loss of property, you know, with the flooding. So I'm in agreement with Mark. I would rather see those dollars go towards the levee repair as opposed to the blue sky of the viaduct.
And you do see the levee construction repairs just up a little, or just, it's the next item, actually, after the viaduct.
Which we anticipate 75% reimbursement.
Councilman Yerger.
So when we went through the viaduct issue years ago, things have changed on the 23rd Street corridor since that time. They're changing as we speak, and I don't know what kind of impact analysis there was relative to the cemetery property and the property to the south, which looks like it's being developed by Nye. The trading post is gone. And so I'm just wondering, does that study accommodate the changes that were anticipated? Because I assume these changes weren't anticipated when we looked at this project before. So we'll need to look at that again, even as feasibility, since some of this is changing?
In regards to the properties, no,
Yes.
that was all looked at very, very early in the project, what properties would be impacted. The impact to the cemetery was real estate-wise. I mean, taking of property was minimal or none. The properties to the south, like where the trading post was going to be completely taken because the way they were doing the intersection to get onto Summers Avenue. But that was all taken into account, and then there's also some properties on the west side of the railroad tracks that were either partially taken or total takes, was what they call it when they buy the entire property. But they do that very early on in the project during the preliminary design, and then they move forward with the environmental because properties that are being purchased is still considered part of the environmental parts of the study, because you have things like historic buildings, et cetera, environmental justice, that type of thing. So we wouldn't see a whole lot of difference in the footprint that we have on the table right now to the final footprint, because as part of this project goes on or process goes on, you also get into right-of-way. So they try to nail that down pretty early.
Okay. So, but you did say that was to take out the trading post completely. That property would be consumed.
That's correct.
But isn't that property being used to expand Nye Square, or am I incorrect? I thought.
No, well,
It's proposed to be yes, and so that's his dilemma, is does he go forward with that project or does he wait for the viaduct? He's unsure what to do.
we have met with them already, and they're well aware of what the proposed footprint is.
Okay, thank you.
But is this 27 million, does that let's say he moves forward with his project and we still have to take that property, does this have the higher amounts that would cost us to take that property in there?
That was done about, gosh, 2 years, 3 years ago, that cost estimate.
Yeah,
So
the answer would be no. It would cost more because if he makes those
it
improvements.
potentially could, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The one thing, the overall project of 3 million and 27 million does have a pretty healthy contingency, but that's still only, that's probably not enough to cover everything and the increases that are gonna come down the path, and then they're gonna wanna put another contingency on it. So we're probably, as Dave said, 3 years out. If you took even a 5% increase per year, we're probably now in that 35 million range.
Those were all the additional comments I had for the street fund. Were there any other questions?
I just have one quick one, I guess, with regards to when we looked at the 1 and 6 year plan several meetings ago. There were several repairs, and I haven't studied the detail of this to see where they may be sequenced, so I'm just going to ask and you can clarify. There were some that have been carried for a number of years that had not moved into current cycle. And I'm wondering if now, if I studied this, would I see that those have been moved up into current cycle and that other things that weren't in that cycle are later in the cycle, or some of those being shuffled back again and still not making the list in the near term?
I would defer that to Dave.
The answer to that is yes to all of them.
They're moving up, they're not moving up?
Well, the last 1 and 6 you did was for this year. Now, our construction year and our budget year are different because we don't stop construction on September 30th. We just keep going until the snow flies. So all our projects for like this year are kind of 2-year projects in the budget. So our 1 and 6 though covers this year that we're in. So the projects, we had military overlay, which is completed. We had Bell Street overlay. We went out for bids and failed to get any bidders, and that's mostly because of the weather conditions we had this spring, and the contractors were just booked up doing repair work all around the state. Luther Road was slid back another year because of that same thing. So what you saw in the 1 and 6, we probably did about half of those projects, and then I wouldn't even say half, probably 2/3 of those projects, and then the other third slid forward, and then we pulled projects from, I guess what you'd call the out years, what would have been black on the 1 and 6 year map, and pulled them into, I guess, next year's budget, and then in this case, the following year budget, the 2021. So it's yes, we slid some projects back, and then other projects we pulled from the out years, or what I call it, the years 2 through 6, and put them into this next coming 2 years for construction.
If you'll turn to page 8, looking at the airport fund, I wanted to visit with you a little bit about the airport terminal building. Council was asked to commit funds in September of last year, and at that point, council had approved committing $1,240,000 to the terminal project. We had an additional $250,000 that would be from the way that you're looking at it now. It shows that we would need an extra $250,000 of reserves, but then this, where it says fund reserves, or FR is fund reserves, There's not $510,000 in the airport fund. Frankly, they're getting close to spending all that they had on the engineering and their share of the apron that you see down below. So we would, in order for this project to stay in this plan, we would need to bring an additional, what, at this point, 760, I believe, $1,000 out of general fund revenues to cover this project. Alternatively, you could look at using perhaps some Keno dollars. Keno would be the community betterment. It's possible to use that, but we don't have a ton left. I wouldn't say we have all $670,000 that we would need there, but we do have some in Keno money, if that was something that was a consideration. But the way that it is now, this project is not really funded through any other source. It's on the city to do that project.
Is that the apron, or is that the apron and the terminal?
That's the terminal separately. The apron is below, and we have used the funds available to move forward on that apron project. That's underway right now.
So you're saying the number we're short is about 760,000? Is it 760 or 670? You said two numbers.
I apologize, it's 760.
Okay. And that would have to come either from reserves or from Keno or from the 8-ball.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that covers the governmental funds. Good news, I don't have a lot of conversation about the utility funds. I'll go through.
We might wanna see
Jody,
if there's
just a
any
quick
questions.
question.
Sure.
And I'm going back to the airport again. Really, in 2019, 2020, we're going to get the apron done. Then we got to go out for design. I mean, that's kind of where we're headed.
For the terminal.
Then we got to go out for design for the terminal. At the end of the day, that 760 probably isn't necessary till 2020, 2021.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct. But the airport fund is not generating that kind of additional revenue.
I get it, but that's where you would have to
Slot it.
That's where you would have to slot it. That's all I'm getting at.
Sure.
I mean, you don't really need to slot it into the 2019, 2020,
Right.
but you do have to slot it into the 2020, 2021 timeframe.
Dave, what do you think?
Is that fair?
Actually, I have the scope of services on my desk for the design of the terminal, the actual building and the parking lot for the building right now. Speaking with our architect, he's confident they can design all of that this winter, and if we would so choose, we could begin construction next year, which would be 2020. I guess it's up to the discretion of the council to decide what their schedule would be on that, because we will have the apron project under construction next year. That's the airplane parking pad.
And how long was this construction on the terminal? What do you think?
If they started in the spring, I'm fairly confident they could build all that next year. It could spill over into the following winter, because once they get the site work done and the shell, then they can work inside, and that's work they can do over winter, if it came to that. Otherwise, it would roll back into 2021.
So it may be slotted correctly.
I would add that project, since it's self-funded, it doesn't go through the whole FAA review process like we did on the apron. We design it, then we have to submit, kind of a limited amount of documents to the FAA and the NDA, the Nebraska Department of Aeronautics, for their review, but it's not near the process that we went through on this other project.
Would you explain why we're going to self-fund it, please?
Because there's just the FAA and Department of Transportation, you know, they only have so many dollars, and terminal buildings are not really high on their priority for funding. So we did have the grant allocation monies that we were building up, and then all the other allocation monies that other airports had turned back, and that's what they used to pay for the terminal apron area. They would rather fund actual hard infrastructure, similar to what Jody said earlier about things that you can see on the Parks Fund. You know, the terminal areas, parking area, apron area is actually used for aeronautic, you know, there's planes there. The terminal building is somewhat discretionary.
The challenge is to spend the money for the apron and not do the terminal would be a tragedy. So, I mean, that's what council needs to look at. But it's a huge driver of economic development, and we saw how critical it was, and the need for something new during the flood, and how well it was used at that time. So, Councilmember Jacobus.
Just a question for Mr. Godeken. On the terminal, if we do allow money now in our budget for next year, at least for the design, I mean, is that something that we can split and try to figure out, you know, split that missing 760 grand, split them amongst the years and know that we're going to do the design and the environment or anything else that we have to do, so we at least have that initiated and then on the table for the following year to follow through with?
Well, there again, it goes back to what I had said earlier. Our construction year and our budget year are different. So the project, even if we started in the spring of next year on the terminal building, the actual building itself, we would not likely be finished by September 30th. So that project's going to carry over into 2021.
Regardless.
Regardless, yes.
So it'd be something we could easily split amongst the years.
Yes, I would certainly desire to, at a bare minimum, get the design finished. So we got a set of plans, then we kind of know where we're at dollar-wise, and we know where
Sure.
we're at for our footprint, where the building goes exactly and how it's going to look. As a bare minimum, I'd like to see that. It would, as the mayor stated, it would really be good for these projects to be done simultaneously.
I agree
I like
with
that.
both of you. Thank you.
Was there anything else on the governmental funds? Ben? So we can move on to enterprise funds, proprietary funds, utility funds, however you want to phrase them. When you're looking at the electric production, that's the power plant that we have. And as you're looking at some of the projects that we have out there, it's, you know, a lot of investment out there already. But remember that I know at least one of the generators is older than I am. And
That's
Jeff
not very
has.
old.
That's a testament to what Jeff and his crew have been able to keep running for us. So just as you're looking at this, again, Jeff's done the nice cascade of projects that you see laid out here. And I believe he would tell you that as he's budgeting for these things, it's worst case scenario. In some instances, we would be doing some kind of inspection or evaluation, and maybe we wouldn't have to do that project, but we want to have the funds available in case we need to.
Or if something else blows up, sometimes it gets reshuffled.
Exactly. On the electric distribution, it's the noted as page 3 at the bottom. There is an amount showing for a new substation, possibly, and that's quite a ways out in the budget, but that would be, we don't show anything in outside funding, but should that go through, the need develop that we would need that, the industry that would be needing the additional capacity would contribute to the amount that they would be using the capacity of that new substation, if that makes sense. So it wouldn't, we don't show that extra funding source there, but know that they would be there for that purpose. Turning to the water fund. The couple of headlines there, Keith has talked to you about looking into those horizontal wells. We'd be looking at issuing bonds for that purpose. If they come to fruition, the price tag over the 2-year period would be about $7 million. And just a small comment, because as I was reviewing the capital improvement plan in anticipation of tonight, I looked down at the last one, the second to the bottom, where it says fire hydrants. And, you know, there was a conversation just recently about how now fire hydrants will be paid for through subdivision agreements. There are a couple of subdivision agreements that predated that mindset. And so we would still have some that we would need to be putting into place in the 2020 year, but then after that, those are all designed to be just common replacements. You know, they need to be replaced every few years. I think the number that we have plugged in there is about 15 hydrants a year, just as they age, that kind of thing. Looking at the wastewater treatment plant on the next page. The big project that Keith has out there, and it doesn't come into play until 2021, would be the odor control project. And surely as Fremont moves further east, that will become more and more important. And moving on to the warehouse, which is marked as page 7 at the bottom. There's a storage building. We actually need to make a change to what you're looking at. The very first item, again, following up with the department head, we had $350,000 in the year-end estimate as that project being done, and that's not the case. We need to add $500,000 in 2020 for that project to go through. And Dean has noticed it as a split. What that means is the warehouse is becoming more and more, frankly, like accounting and IT and HR, where they're more like internal service departments. They're not necessarily just a function of any, like the electric fund or the water fund. And so that project, the cost would be allocated amongst the funds, but rather than bore you with teeny tiny parts in all across the funds, we're keeping it together as we do like IT and accounting functions as well. So we would be adding $500,000 in the 2020 budget for capital. Moving on to IT, one of the first things I noticed is the very first item. It's at the bottom of page 7, that we have 0 allocated for the planning and engineering module. And at first I thought, well, gosh, I know that project's underway. They're coming and doing training. Why is that? Well, the way that we're working with our, I don't know what you want to call it, SunGuard, Superion, Central Square, but our enterprise software, we're working in the cloud now. So it's no longer we're buying software that becomes our property. We're using it's software as a service, SaaS. And so it really is a service, so you won't find those on capital anymore. You'll see a couple of other modules that also have 0 in the capital. That doesn't mean they weren't funded. You'll see those as increases in the IT budget for his contractual services for service agreements. That's where those numbers were moved to. And on the building is again something that gets allocated out to not just the utility funds. 50% goes over to the city because it is used for City Hall as well. And you can see the large project there is the air handling zoning changes to our HVAC system.
And the elevator.
And the elevator, thank you. I know we went through those pretty quickly, but did anybody have any specific questions for the department heads that were kind enough to join us tonight?
Any questions from the UIB? Councilman Ellis?
Jody, I've got just one overall question. This is kind of a 2020, 2021 budget. What was the end, I mean, I've heard some things on the radio or whatever. What is the end dollar amount? Are we within budget right now, or are we over budget, or we got to figure out how to make cuts, or what's the...
I should have given you my outline because that's coming.
Okay, okay. I'll shut up and let you continue on.
You're obviously, you're
Okay.
asking questions that I have answers to, so
Okay.
yay.
You can answer them at your leisure. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I have some handouts here for you all. Dan has them. So I'm assuming you need to take a motion. We were asked to provide the dollar amount changes from one study session to the next. So we have those available. It's split out between governmental funds and then the utility funds as well. So it gets you from the last presentation that we did to this one.
Councilman Legman, do you have a question?
I make a motion to receive.
Okay. Councilman Jensen?
I'll second the motion.
McLean?
Yes.
Ellis? Coons?
Yes.
Bechtel?
Yep.
Yerder?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Jacobus?
Yes.
Legband?
Yes.
Motion carries 8-0, Mayor.
Which one did you start?
I won't go through these because obviously you can see it's an exhaustive list. Some of these were tweaks that needed to happen just as we were looking over the budget as a whole. Some of these were things like grant appropriation or grant dollars that had not been taken out of our year-end estimate for things that we weren't anticipating getting.
What else you got there? It looks like, here's the utility ones, right? Property taxes, city, so.
The utilities are 2 pages and the city was 3 pages.
Are they all stapled together, Dan?
No, the city one's beginning with 001 for account number. That's 3 pages.
So, does anybody have a 51 yet? I think we don't have the 51s out yet, right? What do you've got there? You got 001?
There's a 51. So you have 51s? Well,
Oh, I bet we have like every other. Things like every other. So we need 2 more 001s going your way and 2 51s going your way. There you go.
Make a note of the staple and stuff.
so here's 4 001s.
One city and one steel.
So is anybody missing
So
the
you should
51?
have a 001 and a 051.
So here's a 51. Is there any extra 001s? Okay.
Here's a 51. Everybody good?
I don't know if you need that.
Okay, the county has provided us the final valuation and we're very excited about that. It is not included in anything that you're seeing because we just got it yesterday. Our final valuation is $1,680,835,484, which is a 6.65% increase. And our, if we were to use the same levy that we have for our general fund from last year, that increases our general fund property tax request by $402,000. So you'll see that change incorporated in next week's presentation when you have your public hearing about the budget. $1,680,000, or excuse me, $680,835,484. Mm-hmm. So the question came, how do things look? How did we turn out? Actually, better than I had anticipated, but obviously it's never as good as we hope, right? From the worksheets that you all have, if you were able to find the general fund total revenues and general fund total expenditures, you would find that in 2019, in the fiscal year we're in right now, we would have shown a use of fund balance of $733,000. We had budgeted to provide just shy of $165,000. So that's quite a shift. I've identified what those differences are. One of the items is the flood activity that obviously nobody had budgeted for. The amount that is included in the packets that you have total $650,000. Some of it, a little bit of it is in inspections, but the rest is you'll find in the interdepartmental, sorry. So 001-1015, that activity that's 1015. We should get about $75,000 back in grant funds for that, against that. So approximately $487,000 we'd be getting back. 75%. Mm-hmm. We also have a mistake in the year-end estimate for the police capital budget. We inadvertently included some of the items twice. They have them listed up above, and then there's an amount that's in the other capital outlay, but that includes the items above. That total was just almost $236,000. This is a number so that's a number that we will change on the next group that you see coming through. Property tax collected is $200,000 less than what we had anticipated for this year. And collections, we really can't do anything about one way or the other, but we just literally looked at it just now to see what we had through August. We obviously don't have September receipts yet, and we will also add in October receipts, but that the number that we gave you would be what we've actually received this year to date, and then adding on what we received the last 3 months of last year. So to give you that total amount. We also looked at estimates. The garbage hauler tax is low by $65,000, and sanitation, that's the waste transfer piece for the tipping fee. We believe that estimate that we have listed is $203,000 less than it really should be based on year-to-date activity. So we're moving from basically a loss of $733,000 to a positive $317,000 in this 2019 budget. So we'll provide fund balance back into reserves. 317,000 approximately.
Estimated.
So looking at 2020, again, you doing that same exercise of comparing revenues and expenditures, you would find that we had anticipated using fund balance or showing a loss of $5,700,000, well, just shy of $5.8 million, frankly. So where that comes from is, if you look at the capital improvement plan on the general fund, we had committed dollars of $407,000 that we would be planned use of reserves, either committed funds or reserve funds. The reserve funds in capital were $914,000. I mentioned earlier the parks transfer to the street fund for the new building. That would also need to come from reserves, and that's $2,333,334. When you looked at your packet and the first expenditure page is the city council, you saw the $1,490,000. That's the transfer for the airport. And for the terminal. Thank you. And then in the budget that we have provided for 2020, we had public safety anticipation notes of $1.2 million. That revenue was not added in to the worksheets that you have there. You won't find that in that first year of the budget. So if you were to make the change to add the public safety anticipation notes, if that's what the choice is to do, we would actually be bringing back about $500,000, which is about what the additional amount the airport needs. It's pretty close. So as of right now, it appears that the 2020 budget is in the black, in the general fund.
As long as we use reserves.
Yes, it is dependent on those reserves that I have listed.
Yep.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
the estimated taxes.
Yes.
Because what did you bump up the taxes in 20? 5% again?
No, from what you've seen,
Oh, from the 6%.
right.
Gotcha.
But from what you see today to what we receive, what the information that we received, we would add another $141,000 to general fund revenues for property tax that would come in.
Yep.
Jody, how much was the total coming out of reserves?
Well, I don't have that all put together into one single number. Do you want them all again? I can give them to you again.
1.2.
407, 914, 2.3333 million, and the 1.490 for the terminal building. Those are the reserves.
So 3.3.
Yeah, it's roughly $1 million, 3.3, 4.5, right at 5.
5 million.
Yeah, that would make right about 5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And we were at 11 million in reserves going in. I mean,
That was 11 million, plus there's a $3 million set aside already. So we're really at more 14 million. Yes,
For capital projects.
for capital projects.
We've actually taken that 3 million for the last 2 budget cycles and moved it each time.
It's not been cumulative. It's only.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying we moved the 3 million,
Always had it there.
always had it there
Just in case.
in the budget cycle, in case there was a need to do a capital project, which we had these for, you know, whether we were gonna do the police station or whatever, we wanted to make sure we had those dollars available.
So what's special about the 3 million?
At the time, I think it was a number that, I should let you do this, but it was at the time, what we were told was, for accounting practices, you have to have so many dollars in there. If we took the $3 million in, Jody still had a safe amount of reserves, and so that's why we took the 3 million back then. The 3 million just carried over the next year, so I don't know that we may have said that, I don't remember, but I do remember that conversation taking place, is we wanted to make sure to keep our bond rating, to keep everything in place, we wanted to make sure we kept strong reserves, and she can kind of go over that in more detail.
It's really, the term committed funds is an accounting term in governmental accounting, where you have to list out all of your fund balances by their purpose. And if council chooses to commit funds, and it can only be by council action, they can commit funds for whatever purpose they want. And then only council action can undo that. We break those out and pull those up out of unrestricted. Otherwise, we would be showing the 14 million in unrestricted reserves.
So council at one point in time took 3 million and reserved it for something.
For capital, yes.
No project, just for capital.
No, we had identified the projects when the 3 million came up initially. It was a large project discussion. And I'm trying to think, the notion was that there was going to be a portion for the library, and there is, a portion for the auditorium, and there is, and for the airport, and for Splash Station, with that bond issue that we had last year. When that bond issue failed, we didn't like uncommit the funds for Splash Station. That's still out there. So the total of those were $3 million. So they were committed for particular projects. And so
Which
when
would have covered the 3, and then there was like 600,000, I think, for Splash Station that we set aside.
yes. So moving on to 2021, that one, still have a little bit of work on that one. I did look, oh, no, excuse me. Sorry, got to look at my notes again. So let's go back, if you don't mind, to the capital plan. I did talk to Tina before the meeting. She had in the 2021 budget, there was approximately $290,000 in projects that would need to be done if we didn't do the renovation, but those projects are being done as part of the renovation. So it's almost kind of like the police department where you either do this or you do that. So, and that amount is $290,000 that we can pull out of the use of fund balance that we have remaining. It starts out at $1 million. We had committed or reserve funds of $882,000 on the capital improvement plan. And looking at that anticipation of paying back the sales tax for the Nebraska Advantage Act. The effect of that would decrease the amount that we would get in property tax relief out of Fund 57, about $283,000, so we'd add that back in, leaving us right now with the shortfall of $410,000, but then we'd be able to subtract the 300, just shy of 300,000 from the library's budget, where it appears that it's kind of a duplication. So the question comes, what could we cut? Where are we at on that? If you look on the capital plan, there really aren't a lot of things on the general fund capital plan that aren't funded by some other source. Because when I was looking at it, I thought, oh, well, maybe they won't get quite as much done on the new police station, let's say. Oh, great idea, except those are being funded by bonds. Has no effect on the levy and the dollars that we have available to us. It really boils down to the $500,000 that we're left with. That's about the amount of the 5% in the increase in the salary and benefits from 2020 to 2021 in the general fund. It's right at $500,000. So 2020 is fully funded, 2021 is not.
We're close.
But it's close.
Jody, the number you said, 5 million coming out, is that just for 2020? And then you gotta look at a whole other set of numbers coming out of the reserve for 2021?
Just the 882,000, yes. And those are all marked on the capital improvement plan as is. So, you know, if the choice is to not use those, then we'd have to look at either other funding sources for those projects or whether those projects would move forward.
Just, you mentioned that we have 1.6 billion as far as valuation. The same levy that we did last time. That levy still needs to be, isn't there some sort of portion of that levy that the council votes on? Or is that?
Sure, and that would be, the first time you'll hear that is at next Tuesday.
Okay.
And the anticipation, we always have gone with the, at least for the first hearing, to say no increase in tax. In terms of the levy, we've taken in the past, the city's taken the approach that growth, always a good thing, and growth is what allows for those increases in our budget. So if the wish is to do something else, to spend more money, we would need to raise the levy likely for that purpose.
That levy, I believe, is a calculation of several things, and that, wasn't there 1% of the levy or something that was allowable by the council or something like that? I could be totally wrong, I'm just going off my memory.
Sure. What you're talking about is our budget authority. How much we can totally spend. So that 1% just allows us to be able to spend additional dollars, but not levy it. The levy is a whole separate thing.
Which would be an emergency situation, would be the only reason that would be there, but you want to have that in place. Or past councils have voted for that, to have that in place in case there was that emergency.
Well, and that is one thing in the whole budget process that is cumulative, because you take last year's ending number and start your worksheet with last year's number at the top. And so if there are years that council chooses not to approve that 1%, that's reducing the amount that future councils will have available to them in terms of spending.
Councilmember McLean.
Jody, so going back to the, and I may not have gotten this exactly right, but the flood activity caused us about $650,000 of additional cost in the current budget year, correct? 75% of that will hopefully get refunded back to us through the FEMA
Right.
claims that we've submitted. Realistically, then when would that money come back? Would we maybe see that in 2021 to help with the shortfall in that year? Or I mean, I know it's a long process. I guess I'm just, your best guess.
I would say not before 2021, absolutely. We just this year received, in 19, we received the funds for the, it was just a windstorm, wasn't it, in 2017?
Transmission line,
Straight
yeah.
line wins.
Yeah, straight line winds from 2017. We just got the last of that funding just this summer, and they closed out that project. And that was a much smaller project than the flood. Yes. And that's the thing too with, we're budgeting on a cash basis. And so that's why you don't see that money coming back in. You know, we could put it in the 2021 budget and would help the fund balance look better. But we really don't know for sure when that would come in, but the expenses are gone.
Councilman Yeager.
Just a quick question with the handouts that you gave us that showed the study session changes. Thank you for providing that as well. But there aren't any totals on here, and so I'm wondering if your worksheets have totals that would show, we can certainly add them up ourselves, but that would say, well, okay, we took money out of this one, but we added money in this one, and so if I were looking at my overall grand total budget, I had X initially, I modified it up or down $500,000, the next one was X, and I went up $750,000, whatever. I'm wondering, do we have that kind of a higher level pictorial that shows us what the activity was in grand total and what we're doing as you're massaging things in and out and making adjustments, et cetera, so that we can see at high level what the overall budget is versus when we get to the point of discussing how much do we have to cover.
Right, that would be.
Seeing what this shifts around, I think, is something that's helpful.
Sure. And as you can tell from that, if memory serves, it just goes completely without regard to revenues or expenditures. So something as simple as you can't just do a sum total on that field. We're going to have to do the pluses and the minuses. So we can provide that, but we don't have it tonight.
That's fine. If you can get it, that'd be great.
But realizing some of those are just double countings and other mistakes or other things that maybe weren't a tweak, it's just, oh yeah, we caught it because we had entered it twice or failed to enter it completely.
Right, right. And that's something that, as I was going through our year-end estimate, I'm not sure I don't think I mentioned 180, for those of you that were trying to write these down and keep track, there's $183,000 in 2019 year-end estimate, $183,000, a decrease in our transfer from the utility. That's a number that's going to stick, and we can't change it. When we budgeted by mistake looking at current year revenues. When in fact, when we do the projections for that transfer from the utilities, it's always looking back 1 year, the year that just finished. And so the amount that we had initially budgeted for that transfer was increased because there was the presumption that Costco could be online by now. Obviously, they're not. And when we went through and made that true up at the end of 2018, we recognized that we made that mistake.
Overestimated by 180,000.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So bad news on this side. Now we turn to the UIB and say, hey,
Good
guess what,
news.
guys? You've got another $183,000 in your year-end estimate. We can go through, I wasn't going to go through nearly the detail on the utility funds, but we do have those summary pages available. Probably have quite a ways to go down, Tyler. they look like this.
Okay.
115, Tyler.
Thanks, Brian. Great. Okay, so this is the electric fund. And the kind of recap that you've like to see, you'll find on this report. It's designed to be on a cash basis, but we do show you what we anticipate, where we anticipate our net income to be. And overall, on the cash basis, this fund is doing fine and sustaining. We are looking at the differences in our net income from one year to the next. One of the larger things, of course, if you go up to the line that says depreciation, amortization, you'll see significant increases, and those are due to the significant increases in capital assets that we have. And production costs have risen, but at the same time, electric sales have increased. We are sending this information to our rate analysts to see if we need to make some changes to rates for the electric fund to bring that into a positive net income rather than negative. The transfer out that you'll see in 2020, that is the electric fund's contribution for the street fund, or the street building, or multipurpose building in the street department, let me say it that way. Water fund activity.
So actually,
sorry.
and I'm just thinking out loud here, the number is increased in production 2019, 2020, and 2020, 2021 would take into account the increased electrical usage since it's up almost 5 million for Costco, I would assume.
Yes, yes.
And that's still an estimate.
Exactly. That's been our conundrum in all the utility funds, because we know that basically in all of the funds, our loads will change. Some will increase, some will decrease. We, as of right now, with between Costco and the anticipated changes at Holstone, those are kind of in flux. And so what we've done is done our best effort to say, assuming what they're telling us today, this is what we're gonna budget for. And we've really involved the department heads. I feel like we've really involved the department heads in the conversation of so that we have a like and a reasonable amount of increase in revenues and also in production costs, so that we don't have that, one person's budgeting this way and another person's budgeting it that way.
Councilman, you're...
So you have an estimate that you've tried to put in for commercial or for Costco and those kind of things. What about for the growth in all of the developments that have been going on in Fremont? Is there an estimate anticipated for the residential side of growth in here, or that
Yes.
hasn't happened yet? Is that built in also?
That's built in as well.
Thank you.
Fremont typically hasn't had much growth at all, and certainly Jeff will tell you that our demand is actually overall has decreased as more and more homes are becoming energy efficient. And so there's just a very modest amount, but that was taken into account, and that increase was only on the residential, not, oh, here's Costco, now let's add another 3% or whatever. I don't recall the exact percentage on that. If we did the utility board have any questions on that? Okay. If we turn to the water system, this one ends up looking quite a bit better than the electric fund, which would suggest that for now, our rates appear to be at a competent level. We are showing a bit of a decrease in the cash flow, moving from 3.8 down to 1.5 million. But that, as I said, is more related to the process of cash and using bonds, and the bond retirement on some of these bonds. I think we need to consider refunding some of these bonds if we can, because we're coming to the end of some of those projects where we maybe bonded it initially in, say, 2003. And typically those, if you look at a bond amortization schedule, they always put those large principal amounts toward the end of the project, or the end of the bond term. And we always look at it and go, oh, we'll worry about that in 15 years. Well, 15 years is here, folks. And so what you're seeing on the amount that we're paying in bond retirements is increasing. Actually, it's not so much in this fund as it is in the, I believe it's the electric and the wastewater treatment plant. The bond retirements are notably higher.
So that would be, you'd just get a hold of John Tresick and have him come in and review, or?
Well, that would be delightful. However, Mr. Tresick retired in June.
Good for him.
Yes. And our municipal advisor that we appointed was emeritus about this time last year, with Scott Keene and Bruce Leffler, who abruptly resigned from emeritus just last week and are now working for Piper Jaffray. So we're not alone.
Someone would come.
Someone will come. I have been in contact with kind of our sister cities, North Fork and North Platte, and then I also contacted Lincoln because I know they were using emeritus as their municipal advisor. And you know, the notion is probably going back out for an RFQ. The problem is trying to budget without that kind of support and help. It's put a little bit of crunch in my time, trying to research repayment schedules and that kind of thing. So yes, but that is something that I think we should look at. Moving to the wastewater system. That one also is one that we are definitely going to, we have Mr. Kratzky working on some rate analysis for the wastewater treatment fund. We have to service the debt for the $30 million, $31 million of bonds that were attributable to the wastewater. Those are starting to come due, those debt service payments. You can really see an increase there.
In the interest expense?
In interest and in the bond retirement that is down in under disbursements. It's the third line of disbursements. And in 2019, we only paid $350,000, and next year we'll pay 1.2.
Yeah, we need to get that looked at.
And that too, if you're showing those kinds of losses, you'll see the eroding of our cash balance there. And the gas system is perking along fairly well. Yeah, one of the things that you'll notice on your list of changes is the change in the transfer to city. The overall dollar amount, I believe, is fairly close, but we really had a swing in how those were allocated. And the gas fund initially did not look very favorably, but when we went back through and corrected that transfer to city, Dan went through and corrected my mistake. You can see it's much more a level transfer to cities, and it's a little bit less of a hit to the bottom line. But this too would be assuming we're doing all of the projects that are on the capital improvement plan for the next 2 years as well.
Jody?
Councilmember McLean.
I noticed, and you mentioned it before, and I know this from other budgets, the depreciation has really increased a lot because of all the improvements. When does that start to fall back? I mean, is this the peak, or will we start to see that in the next, like, 5 years drop back down significantly, or will it depend on the projects that we do between now and then?
It depends predominantly on the projects because each one would have its own life. We do straight line depreciation. It's not accelerated. There's no clever hit it hard at first and then wind it down. It is straight line depreciation, and most of the assets at the power plant, 40 years.
It could vary from 20 for equipment to 40 for buildings. Jody, I got a question. This is my first budget.
Turn his mic on, would you?
He needs
Could you
to.
give us a little history on our reserves? I mean, we're going down from 11 or 14, we're going to take 5 out. Is that normal, or can you give us a little history of what other councils have done and where our reserves have been in the past?
So our reserves have been building up because each year we've done our very best to provide a
Return.
well, we provide a return, but we budget a zero budget so that there's no, the idea is that it's a completely balanced budget is what we've tried very hard to do in the past. So we've budgeted to show no use of reserves, but we've always brought back in reserves. So you don't budget to spend them, and you keep adding to them year after year. That's how you get to $11 to $14 million in reserves. And right now, we kind of have almost an embarrassment of riches. We highlighted that when we did the management's discussion and analysis in the audit report, and I think I touched on it briefly at the first study session that we had, where typically you would want about 15% of your current year operating expenses. That much you'd want in reserve in a general fund. We have, I believe it's 63%. So we've got plenty of reserves. It's just whatever council's appetite. I would never, personally, 15 would be a bare minimum, 15% would be a bare minimum for me. But I also know that when we go for bond ratings, they really focus on the utility funds, but they also kind of take a quick peek over into the city's funds, and they are always impressed with the reserves that we've been able to maintain. But it's to the point now where, at what point are we apparently taxing people more than we need to?
How much was added to the reserves this year?
That's where, do you remember what it was? Can you look up what it was last year, Dan? Oh, shoot, I should have it right here.
Yeah.
186.
Last year, we added to reserves $1,001,562.
And this year you're anticipating?
And this year, we're anticipating bringing back about $317,000.
How much?
So 317, so it's continuing to grow.
Okay.
So you could almost, $1.5 million has been just returned in the last 2 years.
So the 1,100,000 was last year, and then this year looks like it's 317.
Mhm.
Okay.
317,000.
1,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jody?
But those reserves have been building over time for specific purposes and projects though too. And so some of them now we're getting to, like the new street building, we're finally getting to that project.
In the street, yeah, using of the street reserves, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we've been kicking the can down the road for some time, and, you know, the street building's been talked about for over 10 years. I mean, the library was still being talked about. You've got the city auditorium that was 10 to 15 years. I mean, you got to start fixing some of your infrastructure, and really it's atrocious what the street building looks like. So, and the police station's the other. So, those are the two big ones, and then the terminal, which has already been earmarked. So that's key to growth.
One thing I'd like to add to this conversation, though, with the return of reserves, what that speaks to is the diligence of the people that are behind me.
That's true.
Because they're the ones that are looking, do I really need to do that? Do I need to spend that money? They have the ratepayers and the taxpayers in mind when they approve projects and move forward with things. And I know they've kind of turned a corner a little bit, but I still have some of them that wait till the end of the year to try and get their projects done in a hurry because they like to save that cushion for themselves. And I keep telling them, trust us that if it's in the budget, you should and can spend it. But that's been a slow process, and I think that's sometimes where some of those reserves come from. And that's why moving away from using general fund revenues, which can equate to property tax, and using other sources of revenue for capital projects, that way you're not taxing for those capital projects that may or may not get done in that given year.
Truly, we've been frugal and we've saved, and we now have dollars available to do some of these projects we've been kicking the can down the road so far on. So, Councilman, you're...
So just to add to that dialogue, I think, just to put this in perspective, at least for me. So since we've been building reserves, and now we say we're to a point where we're going to have to consume some of those reserves, and thanks to the due diligence of department heads over the course of time, we've been able to increase those without creating excessive tax burden, I guess is the way I would put it, for lack of better words. Now that we have those funds available and we're in a situation for spending down as we continue the due diligence, one of the things that we can be looking at is whether or not, as a part of that, tax relief is at all possible in this process. When we say we have reserves in excess of what we might need that have been accumulating, we're going to spend some down, but even then, we still have significant reserves that have built up over time. And so as we evaluate what the impact is based on the bottom line when we're all said and done, that's how you would determine whether or not we're holding the line or perhaps could relieve some burden from the residents of Fremont. Is that true?
That would be a true statement, but whenever you use reserves for ongoing operations, that comes back when those reserves are no longer available to you.
No, I understand. It's a trade for the here and now versus the future, and you need to protect for the future. I understand all that. But at the same token, if we're forced to be looking at something where we, budgetary-wise, look like we have shortfalls, well, maybe we don't. Or we're looking at, well, we have a surplus, and do we really need to be adding to the reserve as we think about that in the scheme of things? That's all I'm suggesting.
Sure.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? I don't have the agenda in front of me, but was there anything more?
That's all the papers I have.
I would take a motion to adjourn. Councilman Jensen,
I will make the motion to adjourn.
Councilman Legman. Cast your votes.
McLean? Ellis? Coons? Bechtel? Pierger?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Jacobus?
Yes.
Legband? Yes. Motion carries 8-0,
Ask
Mayor.
Al. Cal needs a motion.
The UIB needs a motion.
UIB? Yeah.
Dave, he seconded.
Dave's gone.
He's gone. All in favor?
They walked out the door.